Woman Jeka, and welcome to our panel discussion for Open House Melbourne. Hey neighbour, building community one block at a time. I'm Rohini Kapadath, the General Manager of the Melbourne's Immigration Museum, and I'm delighted to be joining you from Wurundjeri land. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm speaking to you from, the people of the Boon Wurrung and Woy Wurrung language groups of the Kulin Nations. Please join me in recognizing the diverse and enduring cultural, spiritual, and educational practices of all of Australia's First Peoples, and in paying respects to our elders, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge our Lord Mayor Sally Capp and friends from the neighbourhood circle. The precinct around the Immigration Museum is undergoing a metamorphosis, and it's good to be joined today by the neighbourhood circle, a group of residents, social and creative entrepreneurs, small business operators who are passionate about this part of the CBD and are collectively contributing to its reinvigoration. This community initiative, together with the museum, ties in so well to this year's open house theme of Reconnect, which speaks to our collective desire to reconnect with each other and our city as we reimagine new ways to live, work, and play, even as we continue to experience lockdown and isolation. And I'm so thrilled that we're joined today by someone who really needs no introduction, the 104th Lord Mayor of Melbourne. Indeed, the first woman to be directly elected as Lord Mayor, a most ardent lover of Melbourne and a tireless advocate for the prosperity of its peoples. Our Lord Mayor, Sally Capp. Could we invite you now, Lord Mayor, to deliver your opening remarks?
Thank you, Rohini. Thank you so much. It is an absolute honour to be here with you today as part of Hey Neighbour, building community one block at a time. And this, of course, is part of the Open House Melbourne program, and that festival kicked off last night. It's absolutely brilliant. And isn't it great the way everybody pirouettes to make sure that we can continue with these important discussions, even in lockdown circumstances. So well done to everyone. Like you, Rohini, I want to acknowledge that ordinarily we'd be at the Immigration Museum and we'd be on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woy Wurrung people. Instead, we are scattered across Victoria, perhaps even Australia. And I, on behalf of the City of Melbourne, would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of wherever we're gathered today and pay respects to their elders past and present. I also want to thank our traditional owners for the care that they've taken of our land and our waterways as the longest continuous living culture in the world. And I want to acknowledge and value the central role that our traditional owners play as we shape our future together. Well, we are here today for a very interesting discussion, and I want to say a special thank you to all of the participants, including Rohini Kapadath, who is the General Manager of the Immigration Museum and a wonderful leader in our community. Our moderator today, of course, is the legendary Robert Buckingham, who is the founder of the Turning Circle Collective, a wonderful creative director and design entrepreneur, who also has added a lot of value to our city. Robert, thank you. Wendy Lassica, you are joining the panel as another founder of the Turning Circle Collective, an urban planner and a creative producer. Jason Hornell, CEO of Good Cycles. I just love what you do, Jason, as a social entrepreneur, and congratulations, can't wait to hear more today. And Nain McWhirter, who is part of the Port Authority building as a resident and is also an educator. We really are in for a fantastic session this afternoon. Well, we're here to discuss what makes neighbourhoods special. What does it take to create a sense of neighbourhood? To everybody who's been involved in starting this new neighbourhood group, thank you so much. You are creating those bonds and building cohesiveness at a time when people can feel very dislocated. Recently, we endorsed our council plan, which sets out everything that we'll be doing over the next 4 years. And central to that is the vision of Melbourne as a city of possibility. We have a new operational model to deliver that council plan, and it's focused on neighbourhoods. There are 14 neighbourhoods across the city of Melbourne, and they will play a central role in how we operationalise our council plan. We recognise that there are distinctive elements to neighbourhoods and to communities, and it's important that we operate and deliver good outcomes in a localised and distinctive way. Another feature of our council plan is that amongst our 6 strategic objectives is one that is Melbourne's unique identity and place. We want to prioritise initiatives that celebrate and protect the places, people and cultures that make Melbourne so unique, but also vibrant, and really unlock that creativity we have as a city. All of these elements really add to our recognition as one of the world's most livable cities. And this precinct that we're talking about this afternoon has some very unique facets and characteristics. And I know that this neighbourhood group is going to highlight and continue to build on those characteristics. But let's call out a couple of them. This precinct boasts some of the most significant heritage elements of our city, from an important place for meeting and trading for our traditional owners, through to our big first immigration museum, which was the Port Authority building, and also Melbourne's oldest barber is located in this neighbourhood. And we're really pleased to know that one of the first pubs was also located in this neighbourhood. All of the very important elements that go into creating good communities. But as you'll hear today, it's the precinct that's also in the midst of very exciting transformation as we see huge new projects such as the Collins Arch completed, which welcomes more than 1,900 residents into the neighbourhood. It includes a new hotel, and it does also include one of our new urban parks. We're also pleased that it's a place where people can flourish, and a great example of that is the new social enterprise hub that's being run by Good Cycles, and Jason will be able to talk more about that in a moment. This precinct is the home to some key community networks, forging a bright new future for themselves and for others that come into this neighbourhood. Thank you in advance for the work that you will deliver that benefits the entire city. Together, you are shining a light on the importance and the impact of connecting residents, small businesses, building owners, entrepreneurs to generate new local economies and communities. Using urban spaces is so important for creating opportunities. It's absolutely the platform from which we can continue to grow and in which we can feel the excitement about being a city of possibility. It's inspiring to see your work in action. I'm really looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. So let's get going here in Melbourne, where anything is possible. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing more.
So thank you, Lord Mayor, for your introduction, and hello to everyone watching online, both today and in the future. My name is Robert Buckingham. I'm a creative director and curator, but today I'm pleased to facilitate an online discussion as part of the Open House 2021, a program of events that contributes to us thinking about the future of cities. And thank you, Sally, again. We know what a passionate supporter you are of Melbourne. And we thank you for your leadership at this extraordinary point in our city's history. But Sally, while I have the chance, I thought I'd like to ask perhaps a personal question, if I may.
Please.
Please. COVID-19 and the 5 lockdowns that we've so far had experienced in Victoria as part of the pandemic have affected us all. But you've had to deal with your responses and your emotions very publicly. So firstly, what's sustained you during this challenging time? And I suppose secondly, has it changed your ideas of what is important to Melbourne?
2 very big questions, Robert. Thank you. To the first one about what has sustained me, it's been a really tough time for so many people. And what's really come through for me is that a feature of Melbourne pre-COVID was just that sense of people en masse, a hustling, bustling city where more than 1 million people pulse through our streets every day. And that number of people, their busyness, the way that they inspired others, the way they worked hard, the way that they fought for change, all of that energy really created so much momentum and really sustained me at the time. Now, as we've gone through the last 16 months where we've had lockdowns and we've had the pandemic, which has severely disrupted the city, and at times we've seen less than 10% of our normal foot traffic, where the city streets have been bare, it's still, though, Robert, been people that have managed to sustain and inspire me, because, as I said at the start, that sense of the way that people have pirouetted in sometimes the most ingenious ways, in the most difficult of circumstances, the way that people, even in very tough times, have found ways to be compassionate and thoughtful and caring, the way that we've seen people reach out to help others who are either the most vulnerable or are feeling vulnerable for the first time in their lives. It's really been those efforts that have sustained me, and knowing that behind the scenes, behind those streets that look bare, has been the most incredible amount of work going on to find ways for this city to recover, to sustain people in the meantime, but to be excited and hopeful and positive about our future. Those efforts, in fact, some days I think I've never been busier, and I don't know how that's possible in a lockdown, but it is that sense of work and dedication and commitment to this city. And a distinctive feature for me, which is actually, I think, key to what you are building as part of your neighbourhood, is that Melburnians work very collaboratively, and we're really open to helping others, but allowing others in to help us. And we need that more than ever, because we're only going to be able to get to where we want to go by being very collaborative. And that brings me to the second part of your question. It's not often that you get a disruption like this. Of course, it's a once in a lifetime for many of us, and we have to take this opportunity to be deliberate about what type of city and community we want to be. When I look back to pre-COVID, I realise it was the momentum of a galloping horse, and at best, as city leaders, we were really trying to guide that momentum as one of the fastest growing cities in the world. We're now the most impacted city municipality across Australia, and this time of disruption does give us the opportunity to be deliberate. And here at the City of Melbourne, we call it a dedication to progress. So whilst there are immediate measures that we need to put in place to sustain and kickstart this city and our community, having that dedication to progress and using this platform to really accelerate our way forward on things like sustainability and responding to climate change, on being an equitable and fair city, and progressing programs around affordable and social housing, for example, and making sure that as we go forward, our artists and our creative and cultural and community sector have ways in which they can continue to flourish. Those are the sorts of things that we can be more deliberate about and really accelerate our plans to ensure that they are central to who we are as a city in the future.
Fantastic. I think we can all relate to that, and it's incredibly positive. Sally, one of the other things which a long-term plan that the city have, which is really interesting from the perspective of the area that we're talking about today, is the Green Line project. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
I so would love to talk about that, Robert. Thank you. We think it's really important at times like this that we still have big visions and city shaping projects like Green Line. It's the rejuvenation of the north bank of the river from Birrarung Maar to the Balti Bridge. It's 4 kilometres of what will be green open spaces connected by amazing architecturally designed infrastructure, so that we can have wonderful walking paths and journeys along the North Bank that introduce people into aspects of our city that frankly have been neglected for a very, very long time now. Key to this are the themes around our traditional owners, native plantings, and their stories about what happened along this river, but also to introduce some of the momentous elements of the city's more recent history, including what happened there around the Immigration Museum, Enterprise Park and the Turning Circle. And as much as South Bank has seen the incredible rejuvenation of that part of our city over the last 3 or 4 decades, this project called Green Line is about green open spaces for storytelling, for reflection, and for better connectivity. And we're really excited that it kicks off this year and that we will be one of the partners in your neighbourhood.
Fantastic. It sounds like a wonderful idea, and as you say, a great opportunity for us to be more connected, because as you've said, you know, connection and a connected community is key to our discussion today. So for everyone watching today, we thought it would be useful to get a sense of the neighbourhood or precinct that we are talking about. It's a small but important part of the CBD. On the south edge is Flinders Street and the river. On the north is Collins Street and the fine 19th century office buildings, now joined by the huge new Collins Arch mixed use development and the new Market Street Park. To the east is Queen Street, to the west is William Street, and running through the block is Flinders Lane and Market Street. It's a fascinating part of Melbourne, and hopefully everyone will come and take a look at it when it's possible. But today we're doing this all online because once again, Melbourne's in lockdown. And I think, you know, when COVID-19 hit and Melbourne's lockdowns began, we had a lot more time to think. I spent quite a bit of time in Melbourne CBD, and it was time to observe many of the changes that had taken place in our city. And this was so much more obvious without the crowds and the city traffic. It was time to reflect on what had happened to the city that I've known for more than 40 years, and time to reflect on the planning, the economic and social results of almost 30 years of unprecedented growth and prosperity. Time to consider, as Lord Mayor said, the city that we have all created, and whether it's really what we intended or really what we as a community wanted. Australia's 30-year economic boom has transformed Melbourne from a big country town to an international city, with all the confidence, property development, tourism and retail activity that such status provides. The result have been truly spectacular. It's resulted in a building, population and economic boom, but with all the pressures and impacts that sudden change brings. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and was kind of like the music stopped. The streets were empty, the shops were closed, Melbourne's famous cafe culture was non-existent, and the whole people dynamic was gone. Everything that we loved about Melbourne seemed to disappear in a moment. And while we all sincerely hope that that situation will improve with time, I think it's clear that the pandemic has changed forever the Melbourne we knew in 2019. And so in some respects, it's not just a pause point, it's a turning point. Partly the pandemic accelerated changes that were already happening in society. Retail moving online or a more flexible approach to the workplace are obvious examples. But many believe that the fundamental changes that will occur because of the declining population growth and city visitor numbers will be dramatic. Let's sort of cast our mind back to pre-pandemic days. Melbourne had been annually gaining 100,000 people per year. Melbourne was set to overtake Sydney in size by 2026 and set to have a population of 9 million by 2056. Pre-pandemic daily visitation to Melbourne, as Sally said, had reached nearly 1 million people per day. These numbers, unfortunately, may not return for a decade. Some believe more. And in very simple maths, the relatively conservative prediction of 30% less people in the city mean 30% less office space required, 30% less shops, 30% less coffee bars. This all adds up to a moment of radical change and a time that requires a serious rethink. And part of that change, we believe, is going back to basics and to think about people and to think about neighbourhoods. So, to start our conversation, I'd like to ask Rohini Kabadath, the General Manager of the Immigration Museum, some questions a bit about the history of the area, because I think it's really important to look back before we look forward. So Rohini, the precinct we're talking about today, what makes it significant?
Well, Robert, the Immigration Museum is situated on Wurundjeri land, on a site of great historical significance for all Melburnians. It's also a site of dual and deeply contested histories from both First Peoples' perspectives and that of the colonizers. Across Flinders Street from the museum is the Yarra River, the Birrarung, which was and is an important site for the Boonwurrung and the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. And it was central to their livelihood, their cultural life, and their identity. And for at least 1,600 generations, this was their uncontested territory. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the people of the Kulin Nation would meet regularly near the river for ceremonies, for exchange, for inter-Kulin business and politics, and the land provided them with food, water, medicine, and shelter. Complex protocols surrounded access to territory and resources, none of which were really understood or acknowledged by early Europeans. And if we were to go back 200 years, on the opposite side, where South Bank and the Crown Casino are, there were wetlands that stretched back for about 6 kilometers. It included an extensive series of freshwater lagoons, home to different types of birds and fish and reptiles and other creatures. In fact, one historian described it as being like a temperate kakadu. And it's really exciting now to hear about the City of Melbourne's plans and Sally's own passion project of the Green Line that will, transform North Bank, which is also another very, significant site for our First Peoples.
And Rohini, when settlers made a land grab in Victoria and came to what we know as Melbourne, they stopped, or most of they sort of came to this part of Melbourne because it was the part of the river where freshwater began. Is that right? And also
Indeed.
This was a place where the ships could come, and of course why the Customs House finally became to be built there.
Of course. In fact, opposite the museum is the Queen's Bridge, once the site of a meter-high waterfall, which the Indigenous people named the Yarro Yarro Falls. The Woiwurrung people from the north of the river and the Boonwurrung from the south used the falls as a pathway to cross the Yarra and as a place to trap migrating fish. It separated the salty tidal water from mixing with fresh water. So the location of the old Customs House was chosen for its proximity to this naturally made turning basin and the highest point on the river to which ships could navigate. So the turning basin served as a port where ships unloaded goods and immigrants arrived in Melbourne. And the old Customs House building is therefore adjacent also to the Port Authority apartments. And their location is a reminder of the fact that Melbourne's port facilities originally extended much further upstream than they do now. The Customs House was built to be one of Melbourne's grand buildings. In fact, these first buildings of Melbourne represent the consolidation of the power of the British Empire. The architecture is all about overtly displaying that domination, and its grandeur declared that Melbourne was a thriving and wealthy metropolis linked by trade to Britain and other major cities of the British Empire. And customs was the treasure house of government income. And until the introduction of income tax in 1915, customs duties raised some 4/5 of all government revenue. And you could say that the Customs Department was the government's own gold mine.
Wow. So, and then of course, Customs House becomes the Immigration Museum in the 1996, I think. And so, but you live, you work in the area. And do you think there's any distinct characters? What are the characters of this particular neighbourhood that are special to you?
I think this part of the CB has a unique character predominantly because of its topography. It has a beautiful river running through it, telling a great maritime history, the site of our earliest port. But what's really special is that it is a precinct in transition to a whole new future and evolving into something quite different to what it was. And we heard Sally talk about the significant new amenities, the Collins Arch, development, Market Street Park, W Hotel with its new coffee shop and restaurant overlooking the museum, new bicycle tracks, the social enterprise cluster underneath, the railway viaduct, all offering Melburnians reasons to return to the city. And of course, you know, the museum with its vision of people connected to a shared humanity, embracing diversity for a just future. You know, we're playing a vision and mission aligned role as a connector and creator of safe spaces so that our collective needs and aspirations can be considered here in this precinct in tandem with an understanding of the resources that we all have. So it's therefore terrific also to see the Collins Arch Amphitheatre coming alive with a string quartet during lunchtimes. The Immigration Museum courtyard too, we will see that come alive with performers in due course. So, you know, I'm seeing this as a precinct in transformation and an underutilized part of the city turning into what could become an internationally recognized 24-hour precinct.
Great. And it's sort of interesting, I think, because we sort of think about the city. Some people think about the city as just all the same, but indeed it does have different parts of the city have very different characters. And I thought it would be interesting at this point to introduce Nain McWhirter, a resident of the area and an educator. Nain, 30 years ago, I think there were about 4 people living in the CBD. You know, literally no one lived in the city. Now there are more than, I think, 40,000 people who call the CBD home. And you were one of the early pioneers. You moved into Melbourne, where you live now. So why did you move into the city and what was it like?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, fellow panelists, and a particular hello to all my neighbours, both the distant ones, but also the neighbours in the Port building who are tuning into this webinar at the moment. I feel like such a tiny tessellation in this mosaic that Rohini's described so beautifully, but my story is, 12 years ago, not 30, but 12 years ago, we moved into this lovely building, the Port building. It was just a combination of factors, the usual sort of empty nesting, downsizing impulse, you know, let's see what it's like living in the city. We fell in love with this building. We adore the Port Authority building, and we were very much attracted to city life, the music, the art, the museums, the galleries, and we thought we'd give it a go. And we haven't looked back. We didn't sell our suburban place until a couple of years later, which was a dumb thing as it turned out. But yeah, we're here to stay now. I'll tell you a little bit about the Port Authority building. Is that?
Yes,
yeah,
please.
okay. So as Rohini outlined, it was an important part of the that commercial life, I suppose, of the city, in that it held the Port Authority offices. It was built in 1929. It's in the Beaux Arts style of architecture. And it actually won the Architects Medal, the Royal Australian Architects Medal that year in 1929. It was converted to apartments in 1999, and we actually, like a lot of people, people who buy into this building stay. We bought off the plan and it took a little while to move in though. I think one of the really interesting things that we discovered is when this building was built, it was actually better to be on the lower floors than the upper floors, quite the reverse of what architecture is these days. So the lower floors are incredibly grandly decorated and the upper floors are sparse by comparison. So the lesser administrators have the better views as it was. The building's heritage listed and heritage protected. All of the grand entrances, the grand staircase, the boardroom, are protected and maintained by the Owners Corporation, of which I'm a member. Yeah, so the building's wonderful. We fell in love with it. We still love it. I think one of the other things that I'd like to talk to you about is, just very briefly, is what we love about living in the city. And one of the things that was a real revelation to us was that sense of neighbourhood, the sense of being in a village, actually, having come from not that far out of town, Moonee Ponds, which is a little bit of a village. We weren't expecting that in the city, but as we got to know our area, we got to know the cafe owners, we got to know the shoe repair people, the hairdressers, and they all looked out for people. And we were really happy and quite surprised to find that sense of neighbourhood and community and village already here, and it was a wonderful revelation. We can walk everywhere. We love that. We love our new park. Thank you very much. Collins Arch, or Pants Scraper. It's terrific. Thank you. We can walk to the opera and we can walk to the footy. So both of those things are passions of ours, and we love walking to the Recital Centre, the galleries, everything that Melbourne has to offer. Obviously, COVID's made a difference, and as a resident, it's been really sad to see, I suppose, the diminishment of many of the businesses in Melbourne, but we know Melbourne's tougher and stronger, and will come back even better and brighter. And this is just, just hearing about some of the things today, this Green Line project sounds wonderful.
Great. Thanks, Nate. I think that's really interesting insight into the neighbourhood, and that I think that's what you were talking about, is this idea that different parts of the city have a different character, and how different parts of the city, or the CBD, sort of have their own connections, and people don't necessarily go to the other end of town.
No, that's true.
I understand that your mother also has an apartment in the building, and
she does,
your grandchildren visit often. Which is,
we've got our own little community. It's circles within circles, our own little community within the community. Yeah, and later on we'll talk a little bit about how we use with our grandchildren, use the Immigration Museum and that part of our community too.
Fantastic. The next panellist I'd like to introduce is Wendy Lassica, and I've known Wendy for many years. Wendy's a theatre producer and urban planner, and recently, with another friend, Michael Trudgeon, we started talking about the impact of the pandemic on Melbourne, and together we formed a group called the Turning Circle Collective, referencing, as people have mentioned, the old turning circle or turning basin for ships on the Yarra, but also this turning point in our history. Wendy, do you want to tell us why it was formed, and why really you selected this part of Melbourne to use as a bit of a case study?
Thanks, Robert. Well, we started talking quite early on after the end of the first lockdown, as we saw the devastation that we felt was just taking over Melbourne, the empty streets, the shift to working from home, the lack of international students, all the things that we sort of loved about the city were suddenly just completely not part of it anymore. And, both Michael and you too, Robert, had experienced this before in Melbourne in the early 1980s, and been part of a community that had really developed some interesting creative practices and a community as a result in a building that was empty as a result of another time in Melbourne when things were not doing as well. And so we began to think about how we might be able to re-establish creative production back into the city, I suppose. And in thinking about that, we realised that creative production had actually left in main part well before COVID, but what COVID has provided, and you so eloquently talked about the impact that it was having on the city, was the opportunity to think about these moments and spaces in which perhaps it could be reintroduced. And rather than thinking about it on a CBD-wide scale, we thought it might be more realistic and manageable to look at it on a case study site and to think about it from a much more sort of locally based perspective, really a sort of hyper-local perspective. And in looking around the city, we realised that there were these 4 blocks that we had, we sort of familiarly called them the Turning Circle Precinct, where there was this beautiful new park in Market Street, the new development at Collins Arch, and a really interesting mix of other activity and buildings. And so it really reflected 4 elements that we were looking for, which was high quality public realm, an interesting mix of building stock in terms of age, size, scale, already mixed use. So there is considerable residential in the area apart from Port Authority building and the new Collins Arch. There are also buildings along Queen Street and in Flinders Lane that are residential as well. And the final thing is that there was already existing creative production in this precinct. So as well as the Immigration Museum, there are a number of other tenancies from the publishing industry to architecture and design. And it was really important for us that these networks were there so that we could think about how we might connect into them. Because our sort of long-term ambition is to create a sort of web-like network that connects both spaces, activity, and people. And so, from our point of view, this precinct was a really interesting example for us to test out some of our ideas in terms of reintroducing creative production into the CBD.
And Wendy, also there were discussions with several of the property owners, and it was interesting how so many of the property owners responded to this idea of how important it was for them to have in close proximity a mix of activities and businesses, small businesses and creative individuals and creative activity and the energy of coffee shops and so forth. And that mix, that was what, in a way, Collins Arch was trying to build. And I think, as I understand, or as I recall, the new W Hotel indeed positioned themselves, rather than Collins Street, they positioned themselves on Flinders Street because they wanted to be part of that energy of Flinders Lane.
I think that's true, Robert. And I think that certainly the impression that we got when we first began talking with landlords and with some of the business owners was that they were interested in thinking precinct-wide. They wanted to think way beyond their own sites. They were interested in making connections between the resources and the activities that they had on their sites with other things that were going on. So it was really, there was a lot of support and a lot of interest in getting involved in something like the Neighbourhood Circle, because everybody could see the incredible potential that this had for collaboration across the precinct.
Thanks, Wendy. And I think also just because, as we've said, because things weren't going so well, it was a time when people were very open to think about new ideas. Our next speaker is Jason Hornell. So Jason runs a social enterprise called Good Cycles and is developing a social enterprise village underneath the railway viaduct off Flinders Lane. Now, the viaduct was built in the 1890s and effectively cut the area off from the river. The docks had long before having moved further downriver to the docklands and then closer to the bay. One aspect of the area that we haven't discussed is why there's a street called Market Street right in the middle of our area. And it's really the only street like it in the traditional grid of Melbourne. I've done some research, and there was actually the first major food market in the city, built in 1850, and was in the area. It preceded the Western Market, which was at the top of Bourke Street, and then the Queen Victoria Market, which didn't open until the late 1870s. Eastern Market was pulled down in 1961. It was replaced by quite an elegant 1960s office tower with a big forecourt on Collins Street. It now has been pulled down and replaced by Collins Arch. But I remember as a boy, there was a statue of John Batman in that forecourt with the words, "This is the place for a village." So, Jason, my question to you is to tell us why 185 years later, you believe that this is the place for a social enterprise village and how that came about.
I didn't know that you were going to set me up to try to live up to the legacy of John Batman. But I think it's so, and thank you for having me on the panel today. I'll be open with you. I think as someone who lived in the city from quite an early age, I actually lived on a boat on the river opposite the World Trade Center 30 years ago, I think now, when there was a community down there and used to walk around the city. Initially, I think for Good Cycles, and it was at a point where we were trying to find a new home, and we'd reached out to the Lord Mayor, I think, during that period of time to look for where we could call home, as we were sort of an enterprise that had been, I guess, jumping from place to place for a number of years, and it was a site that I guess we walked past and we looked at it, and we knew the more recent history of the site when we first had a look at it, and that it had been empty and I guess underutilized for a number of years. And that sparked the interest of, I guess, what it could look like, or what the area what we could bring to the area. Social enterprise is mission led. It's about creating value, not only out of social value, not only out of providing programs, and for us it's about employment and jobs, but it's also looking at ways that it can help to drive economic benefits and bring those two sort of pieces to play. And initially we looked at a site and we thought, this is a wonderful place that's not being used, I think, to its potential. And for Good Cycles, we've always been highly collaborative and always looked at ways that we could bring different ideas together. That sparked the idea of what would be a social enterprise village, which was about bringing more than one social enterprise with different missions and different visions to a site, but collectively looking at how we could create more social value, more place value, try to promote what we know social enterprise is capable, and actually be I think part of what, prior to COVID was an incredible period of time, for Melbourne and its growth and everything that was going on. Wind forward, 24 months to where we are now, and I think for us, and as part of this collective, I think the same ideas underpin what brought us there and what we continue to look to do with the site. But now it's even more important about that placemaking, that activation. As the Lord Mayor has highlighted in the Green Line project, in the Green Project, this part of the city has always kind of been quietly got about its business, but it's never seen what its huge potential is. We sat and watched. We sat opposite, actually, on the seats of Immigration Museum for about 6 months, leading up to sort of figuring out what to do with the site, and that's a whole nother story. And we watched what would happen on that site on a day-to-day basis, and there'd be school groups coming to meet on that site to come across to the Immigration Museum or to go down to the aquarium. And we realized that it really was an important site for Melbourne now, and then looking at the history of the site and the site as it was for the Indigenous culture, it even more highlighted the reasons why we decided that we thought for us as a social enterprise, as in a community enterprise, it was really critical for us to be part of what we want to do there.
Right. And so, Jason, Good Cycles is an organisation which does bike repairs, but also does training for young people. And so some of the other businesses, or some of the businesses, social enterprises that you're going to put into the village, could you want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, the village partners, we're all social enterprises or mission-led organizations. The main outcomes of an impact that we're looking for is employment, and particularly employment for at-risk youth and young people. So Good Cycles will use the site to provide not only a community bike shop, serving the bicycle community, Melbourne's CBD bike community, which we've done for many years, but creating those valuable employment opportunities. Other partners on the site, Community Grocer, which Community Grocer is a social enterprise that's providing food and fresh food and fresh produce. They ran a range of markets around Melbourne. They're coming onto the site to provide that opportunity. Back to the days where I think there were, they have a vision for the days where there were fruit sellers on the corners of Melbourne, and people would grab an apple or grab a banana on their way to work. We have Dragonfly Collective, which is looking to create employment and training programs for young people. They have a self-efficacy model that helps to give young people who traditionally wouldn't get an opportunity to look at what it'd be like to create their own business, to do those training programs. One of the most valuable things about where the site is that it's got fantastic access to public transport, to other businesses, to other partners, and including the members of this collective. And Moral Fairground, which is an enterprise that is focused on providing opportunities for businesses and events that have a strong focus on social outcomes, and their role to activate the site and provide those events for us.
Wow, it sounds great, and nice to hear that a market's coming back to the area after so long. In the second part of this sort of discussion, Hey Neighbour, building community one block at a time, I thought it would be really useful to talk to each of the panelists about some of their efforts to, well, build community. Rohini, I'm going to ask you firstly to tell us a little bit about the neighbourhood circle that you've established through the Immigration Museum.
Well, first, perhaps let me just start by sharing with you why we thought it was important to reach out to our neighbors. For museums to retain their relevance and become positive partners in the development of our society, they must use their unique resources and potentials to become more responsive to urban and environmental change. And we thought that today's museums and historic sites are more than places to preserve the art and artifacts and memories of the past. They are the new town square, where diverse members of the community can come together and consider collective aspirations and the big questions and issues of our times against the backdrop of our culture, history, and current affairs. And the pandemic and its devastating impacts on the life of Melbourne CBD has created a new imperative for the Immigration Museum to respond with a more proactive contribution to the social, cultural, and economic recovery of the city, and to be part of a collaborative effort alongside community partners to activate the CBD, and in so doing to rebuild lives and livelihoods. So that was the genesis really of the Neighbourhood Circle. What it is a group of residents, social and creative entrepreneurs, small business operators, and landowners who are passionate about this part of the CBD and are collectively contributing to its reinvigoration. We meet monthly on the third Thursday at the museum, and we bring together these key stakeholders around us to contribute to this growth and recovery. And we're delighted to see the growth in amenities in the precinct around the museum. Our collective aspiration is to build a dynamic civic outcome, emphasizing outdoor and accessible activities and events that will eventually promote, support, and grow a long-term creative community in the CBD as a vital side of production, creative entrepreneurship, and community engagement.
Fantastic. And I think one of the projects that you actually started prior to the pandemic was a kitchen garden or a growing garden, which was connected to, as I understand it, an exhibition that you had at the Immigration Museum, which then led to a relationship with the Port Authority building and NEEM.
Indeed, indeed. In fact, since 2018, we've particularly enjoyed working with our first neighborhood project with the Market Gardeners, which at its core has been a project that cultivates community. And the project has seen neighbors for almost 100 years, that is the Immigration Museum and the Port Authority apartment residents, unite for the first time to care for a communal garden. And it represents an authentic but innovative model of community engagement that lies really at the heart of all we do at the Immigration Museum. And it's required some new thinking and a degree of risk-taking in the use of our spaces. But the Market Gardeners project, nothing Neen can speak to it. It's really been a great example of the museum being a good neighbor and working with its residents to create a whole, new social outcomes, particularly in these COVID times.
So Neen, do you want, perhaps we could turn to you to talk about how that garden project became an interesting way of indeed giving you a garden and giving you another an activity outside your home.
Sure, yeah. It was one of the things we did say was it's taken 100 years to get to know our neighbours, but in fact, ever since the port building was made into apartments, the Immigration Museum was our backyard, really, in a quasi sort of sense, because we have no shared spaces here. This was an office building, so there are no shared communal facilities and no shared spaces. And there are two impacts of that. One is that we didn't get to know our neighbours because there was nowhere to actually gather to get to know fellow residents. And we also don't have balconies or a shared garden. So we would use the Immigration Museum grounds. And as you mentioned earlier, Robert, my eldest grandsons are 9 now, and ever since they could walk, they've been tottering around in the Immigration Museum, paddling in the fountain at the back, which they're not supposed to do, but there you go. So we've kind of been using it, and we had a relationship with the security guards and that sort of thing, but nothing formal with the museum. And then along came these lovely little boxes, and I had my eye on them right from the outset, Rahini, partly inspired by my daughter who set up a community garden in North Melbourne, in North and West Melbourne, called Northwest Patch. So I just saw these gardens and thought, I wonder what they're going to do with those. And we chatted, and so Market Street Gardeners was formed, and it's been really interesting because it brought, this is pre-COVID, 2018. In fact, I think we started talking even earlier than that. It brought neighbours together in the building, brought people together in a way that had never happened before. You basically was high in the lifts, and that was it. So we reached out to our neighbours and said, who'd like to be part of it? And we got about 23 people, which was great. We only had 10 boxes, so we had to put people together, sharing boxes. And very culturally diverse group, and very much a diverse group between owner residents and also rental residents. And people came along saying, well, I've never gardened before, but I want to be part of it. And so there was that sort of learning opportunity as well, which we were very enthusiastic about. Then came lockdown, and we couldn't garden any longer. And the gardens, they've survived because the wonderful Immigration Museum staff keep watering them, so thank you for that. We're not harvesting our veggies as much or our flowers as much. But Robert, did you want me to talk about what's happened in the building since then?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting story, both the working with Immigration Museum, but I think also what's fascinating is how, as a building, I think there are about 100 apartments in
111.
And how during COVID, because you're all locked down, how that brought the building together, or the residents of the building together.
Yeah, it did, but I still credit that seeding, pardon the pun, the seeding of the Market Street Gardeners it gave us a model, it gave us a platform on which to build further. And during lockdown, a lot of our apartments are quite small, one-bedroom apartments with single tenants. And I think there was a real sense of loneliness. And so one of our owners set up a WhatsApp group, and we ended up with about 40 plus members in the WhatsApp group, and they've come and gone a bit as people have moved in and out, but there's still over 40, a core group in the WhatsApp group. We set up a community notice board. It sounds obvious. It sounds like it hadn't happened before. And we also set up a community library, again, something very dear to my heart. And we have, it's not just a library. There are, we keep our little local newspapers there, and people share produce through it and through the WhatsApp group. So whilst it's partly COVID driven, it's also those early steps of Market Street Gardeners and our relationship with the Immigration Museum that brought, become a nexus for that. And it's really transformed the building. People who've moved in recently, even in these COVID times, have said they just can't get over how friendly and welcoming the building is. And let me tell you, having been here 12 years, it wasn't always that way. So yeah, thank you to everyone who's made that possible.
I think that's a really positive story about how, just simple gestures and simple efforts can really bring people together, and to make it, indeed that's about making a livable city. It's those personal contacts. So thank you, Nain, for that story. I wanted to ask Wendy Lassica. Wendy, you talked about cultural production, and you talked or creative production, and I think it would be interesting to maybe tease out that idea of what happens in cities and the role of creative individuals and artists, designers, architects, whatever, working in a city. Because I suppose the history of often the history of sort of gentrification is that what happens is that cities or places fall into disrepair, their rents are cheap, and so then artists and sort of creative people move into those because the rent's cheap, and then as the area gets gentrified and more expensive, they get pushed out. And that sort of has been, that's a push and pull that goes on in the economic market, I suppose, the housing market. And this is sort of what we saw happen in CBD Melbourne a little bit too, I think. And I think we've seen in the last, certainly the last 10 years, so many small galleries, so many artists, so many designers, so many specialist businesses, and lots of small businesses being pushed out by high rent. So your thoughts on how to create neighbourhood are based with this idea of what you call creative production. So do you want to talk a bit about how important that is?
Yes. So when we were thinking about this whole idea of the gentrification cycle that seems to have emerged, over the last 50 years or so, we realised that it is part of that pause moment that I think the Lord Mayor talked about in her introduction, in that we wondered whether that was actually, the best way to think about creative production. And by creative production, I mean the making of, so not just the consuming of creativity and culture, but actually of producing new things and creating small local economies as a result. And it's this interest in creating these long-term economies and community that suggests that we might like to think about moving away from that highest and best use model of space rental, and rather thinking about what sort of cities we'd like to have and what sort of diversity we would like to see in cities more generally, but also across local neighbourhoods. And, a number of people have talked about what it is that they like about their local neighbourhoods, and it is this diversity of experience that goes on, and creative production, you know, contributes to that quite considerably. And we see this as an opportunity to really encourage that, you know, in the Turning Circle project, and through, you know, engagement with the neighbourhood circle, we've been talking about these sorts of ideas.
And I suppose, Wendy, this goes back to the role of cities as being places of interaction, and the place where lots of different people, and people with different ideas and different backgrounds and different work practices come together, and indeed how that creates its frisson, or creates an excitement, or creates an energy. And that's, I suppose, the history of cities, isn't it?
That's absolutely true. And it is that sort of critical mass that is able to occur in cities that perhaps can't occur in smaller towns, that makes it is a big attractor. You know, I think most of us are very social beings, and we like to be around that sort of energy. And it is that diversity that cities provide that is so exciting. But I think that in terms of generating that sort of frisson and that excitement, working on these hyper-local scales means that, you know, very particular identities can grow as a result, and really sort of add a much more interesting flavour to CBDs as a whole.
And so the grand plan would be to try and insert studios and creative workspaces into this neighbourhood to add energy. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's correct. And programs that connect all those activities that are occurring in the spaces. So it's not just about the space themselves, but it's also about the activity that's occurring. And you know, one of our important partnerships is with RMIT University, because we see that opportunity to provide some sort of bridge between newly graduated students and their early career practice. And if we're able to attract these students into this area with spaces and support programs and other networks, we think the opportunity to keep creative production, small-scale creative production in the CBD will be much greater. And so to this end, we're already, Michael and I, co-lead design studios based around the Turning Circle project, and there are 2 or 3 other design studios that have also used this precinct last semester. One, I think, Jason, in your area around the Social Enterprise Hub, and another that was based on the public realm in this precinct. So the idea of introducing these ideas to students as a way of considering what their next steps might be, and the potential for the whole precinct, we believe is very important.
That's great. And I think you raised the really important part, a really important point about the importance of students and the universities in the life of a city. And certainly, you know, in the last 20 years, Melbourne has been transformed by the impact or the influence of international students and the growth of, you know, RMIT, University of Melbourne, and how important that has is in giving vitality in all aspects, the social life, the cultural life, the retail life of a city. And it's really interesting to think about that connection. We're getting close to running out of time, so I wanted to maybe move on to Jason, and I think that's a really good segue, because Jason, you're really doing this. You're, you know, with the social enterprises, you've done a lot of work prior to the pandemic in terms of thinking about creative or creative activity, small businesses, social enterprise businesses, into, you know, injecting them into this neighbourhood. And I sort of would, you know, I was interested in how you see, do you see their role as being connected to lots of other people in the neighbourhood, or are you going to be your own village?
No, I think I find the opportunity of creativity, and I guess there's a definition of creativity which has been, which is used in a range of different ways, and I have come from what was your traditional creative background of music, and I think what fascinates me and what's drawn me to this project and what we're doing is that it is that creative nature of place. Now that relies on economics, social, it has so many pieces of that. For us, in terms of the creativity and what we're looking to do on the site is, Good Cycles has looked at this opportunity as we've set it up, and we've done the work to establish what we hope will be a village that interacts with the broader city, with what has to happen, particularly across the precinct. The creatives we had some fantastic projects come out through the RMIT work and the students that they did down there, which was some really incredible stuff. But remembering that our vision for what the site and for the village is actually well beyond what Good Cycles is and what we represent, but it's also about young people. So our mission, is about empowering young people, giving not only them a voice to, through employment, but also a voice to how they see the future for the city and how they see that looking. We have, a range of creative. I think my son just brought me some lunch. Thank you. So this is about his future. This is about the future of Melbourne, and that's what I think for us, creativity and that creative influence, whether it's directly about, the projects that we've had, whether it's about how we look at the space. And I think people don't acknowledge the creativity involved in space. They kind of take it for granted. And I think for us, that's really exciting. We laugh because, everybody looks at this site and says, isn't it fantastic? Look at, you're activating the site. The partners, we have a governance committee that we put together, which is about, which is trying to figure out how to use it. It's actually we have to be quite creative to figure out how to use a site that's under a train line, that's operated by metro trains. And I can tell you for reference that if you ever want to do a project, don't do it under what is a most significant piece of train infrastructure in Victoria, because the risk people just look at everything you do. So there is so much creativity going on right at the moment on the site just to figure out how we can operate and what we can do. And being part, and again, as I said, pre-COVID, post-COVID, what the city looks like, but what our role in that is. If we're able to bring more young people and activation to the area, engage with what's happening around there, that's really our role. And I think that's what we're really excited about. This isn't about us, or any one building or precinct, one object in the city. It's about bringing those together. And that's why when, we reached out to the Immigration Museum, originally, and now this collective, I think the future is really bright for the area. I think for us, we're hoping that this project seeds not only the idea of what can happen with a space like that, but also what has to happen more broadly across the city.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I think probably we've nearly come to the end of our time, and it's been a great discussion. I'd like to thank everyone who's been a panellist today as part of Open House 2021, and thank you for joining us online. I suppose, just from my perspective, I think what's come out of our discussion is, thoughts on how there are very different parts of the CBD. The city of Melbourne isn't just one one big space, which is all the same. There's lots of different areas, and it's really interesting to look at those different precincts, and the council are thinking about different neighbourhoods. And I think that's really positive, because it looks at creating different characters and exploiting the different characters, or reinforcing the different characters of those places. I think what we've talked about today is how working to make neighbourhood connections can make Melbourne a better, more livable city. And how making this happen is very much about talking to neighbours and working together. It's pretty simple. But I think everyone is still here. Thank you, Lord Mayor, for also staying with us. And I think now Sarah's going to take some questions from people who've been watching.
We have got a couple of questions already in the Q&A, but before we go to the questions, I'm just going to do a quick couple of polls for our audience, just so that we can gather some data on how many people have tuned in today and where you're tuning in from. So I am going to launch a poll now. If you could please let us know who you're watching with from your place, that would be amazing. Thanks everyone for filling this in for us. And then in a second, I'm just going to put up another poll as well. And the panelists, you can feel free to have a look at the questions in the Q&A while I do this.
Gosh.
Right. Now the next poll is, thanks everyone. How great is technology?
So our first question we'll throw to the Lord Mayor, Sally Capp. Thank you for being here, just in case she has to run off to another Open House Melbourne event. This question from Dr. Michael Trudgeon asking, this neighbourhood initiative to connect, reconnect, self-identify and to start to collaboratively map a future for itself. Would love to get your reaction to this, and also whether this is something you are seeing other CBD communities doing.
Well, it's a great question, Michael. And look, while I've got a chance, I wanted to say that we've also got Councillor Jamal Hakim and also Councillor Rashina Campbell online, and we've loved this conversation. We've been texting each other. So thank you. Michael, to your point, what's interesting about this group is the connectivity across business owners, institution, residents, social enterprise. We do have other groups that are well established and up and going. Our business precinct associations, we have 10 of those across our municipality, and our resident associations, we have 8 of those across our municipalities, and they're all wonderful at connecting and working together. We've got about 7 community gardens, etc. But what's different about this neighbourhood and what's so pleasing is that, as I said, it brings the mixture of uses and participants together into one group to show how they can combine. And I think we could encourage more of that as we go forward. I absolutely loved the idea that hyperlocal can generate a frisson of excitement and that sense that networks exist everywhere, but it takes that effort to really create the connection between spaces, activity and people, just picking up on some of Wendy's words as well. And it takes me back a little bit to a discussion with the founders of Highline, which is where the idea for Greenline really started, and that sense of connection and how it started with a sense of needing to program activities to bring people together and to showcase what was possible in those spaces. And actually now they have as many unprogrammed activities occurring, which shows that nurturing and that organic nature of when you create the environment, people do come in and actually fill those spaces with activities that connect and inspire and really challenge and drive a way forward. And we're really pleased that this neighbourhood is coming together to do exactly that, listening to name those senses of the things you organised, but then all of the things that have started to happen more organically and that have been nurtured. And we certainly see one of our responsibilities, that's why we've been texting, as making sure we support that environment for that to happen, both programmed and unprogrammed, and it's been terrific to see. But Michael, to your point, some of those groups already exist, but this intermixing of elements of our community is exciting to see.
Thank you, Sally. The next question we have from Sue Taylor in the audience, and this might be one for Wendy, but it could be one for everyone. I wonder how the creation of the Collingwood Yards precinct and its growing profile as a hub for creative producers might hinder ability to attract creative producers to the CBD.
I'm happy to start this off. Well, Collingwood Yards is a very different sort of model to what our ambition is, and I don't think it will hinder people. I don't think it will hinder people coming to the CBD. I think that CBD holds an attraction for lots of different reasons, not least of which is the fact that it's incredibly amenable in terms of public transport. And this precinct happens to be very well serviced by that as well. So people will start, and also we're not looking at buildings in this precinct. We're working quite slowly to identify spaces and attract people to use those spaces over a period of time, and then build program on top of that. So I think it'll be a much more organic sort of attractor. And we also see that the connection with graduating students and that bridging program that is in its early stages will also bring sort of the next generation of creative producers into the CBD too. So we see this as a complementary program to Collingwood Yards, and certainly not as one that would compete with it.
I think also, in answer to that question, there's also a sense of how, there's both a cultural ecosystem, but also sort of economic ecosystem in a city, and how there's the need for very large cultural institutions like an NGV or an arts centre, which perhaps are more about cultural consumption, in that that's where you show work, but also there is the room for lots of other types of organisations, like we're talking about the social enterprise village, but then Collingwood Yards has a particular focus. I think partly what Wendy is talking about too is this idea of perhaps even a finer grain, where it's a group, it's studio practice, and just as from in different fields, it's big players, it's middle players, and it's little players, but that makes the whole thing work. Because if you just have one or the other, it's sort of not as dynamic.
Great, I think that's all we've got for the questions at this stage. So I think that's probably time to wrap things up.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Unless anyone has any questions of each other. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Is Rohini still there?
Yes, indeed.
Excellent.
Well, thank you all. A warm and sincere thank you to all who have joined us today. Such an inspiring conversation about the benefit of connected communities. And our thanks go to Robert Buckingham for your brilliant moderation of the session, and panelists Wendy Lasica, Nain McWhirter, Jason Hornell. And thank you for your long-standing commitment to the revitalization of the neighborhood. I can't wait for all that lies ahead. I also wanted to extend my thanks to Alice Gibbons and Sarah Craven for their work behind the scenes. There's a lot of work that happens in enabling these sessions to occur. But special thanks go to the Lord Mayor for her dedication and commitment to the city and its future. We look forward to the rollout of the council's neighborhood plan, to building neighborhood one block at a time, and of course the green lines. We're really excited to hear about the behind the scenes chatter with the other councillors as well, and we're looking forward to the ongoing support we receive from the City of Melbourne. And a big thanks as well to Open House for persevering with the program through stage 4 lockdown. It is wonderful that we are all here and we're all discovering new ways to stay connected and to reconnect and to envisage transformative ways to live and work better together to ensure a thriving future for the generations to come. Museums house the cultural soul of a nation, and in fact, they are culture in action, but museums are most effective when they're rooted in their societies, when they grow from their communities and are able to provide visions for the future. So to this end, the Immigration Museum will continue, of course, to play its role in fostering greater understanding and connection between people, particularly in a COVID-impacted world. And if you live within a 5-kilometer radius of the city, you could undertake a tour of nearby buildings using the map we've provided with this program. And we hope to see you back at the museum when our doors open again to view all of our exhibitions, and in particular, our latest exhibition that explores coming of age moments across time, culture, geographies, and identities. So please don't miss this compelling Becoming You exhibition. Once again, thank you all for joining us today.
Well done, everyone.